This is the Boox Go 6, which is really a Boox Poke 6 in, I want to say, disguise, but not really. The similarities are in plain sight, and putting it side by side with the Poke 5, it's almost impossible to tell the difference between the two. Almost, because the Boox Go 6 got a display upgrade, giving the screen better contrast levels, which I'll come to in a moment. So let's check out why this is probably the best 6-inch Android e-reader right now. The Boox Go 6 has the exact same size as the Poke 5, so they are not just similar in design, but essentially identical. The back cover does have a bit of a different material and style though, but that's barely worth mentioning. The Boox Go 6 has a flush and scratch resistant front glass, so it's again a great companion for just putting it in a bag without having to put too much thought into it. Just one thing to remember, the aluminosilicate glass on here is not Gorilla Glass. So while it's scratch resistant, it's not as resistant as glass on high-end smartphones. The frame on the side protrudes just a little over the edges of the screen, which I suspect is done to offer a bit of impact resistance in case you drop the e-reader. I'd go as far as to say that the Boox Go 6 is the first e-ink device of the Boox Go line that really deserves that name because it's just so incredibly compact. Of course, no different than the Poke 5 in that aspect, but still super handy and easy to carry around. One thing is notably different, however, and that's the weight of just 146 grams. That's 14 grams lighter than the Poke 5, so it's not a huge difference, but still welcome. Together with the magnetic cover, it's just under 235 grams, which is lighter than some 6-inch e-readers were a couple of years ago without a cover, that is. So if I'm not mistaken, that's 4 in a row Boox got the weight right in the official specs. I guess they got tired of me pointing out their inaccurate weight listings, so long story short, this e-reader is not just compact, but also very lightweight, which I absolutely love, because reading on here is so effortless and holding the Go 6 is super easy even for longer periods. And somehow Boox still managed to make the Go 6 feel sturdy at the same time. I guess the front glass helps with that a bit, because even when applying a little force, the e-reader doesn't creak or crack and feels solid. The Boox Go 6 got a faster CPU with 8 cores now. I never had issues with the Poke 5's quad-core CPU, but having a faster chip is obviously always a plus. It's the Snapdragon 662, which Boox has been using in a couple of other devices in the past as well. The 2 gigs of RAM might seem a bit limited, but they are enough for typical e-reader tasks. But compared to the larger siblings with more RAM, you can tell that some operations like starting certain apps take a bit longer. But since this is an e-reader first and a tablet second, that's fine. Of the 32 gigs internal storage, roughly 21 gigs are usable. And if that's not enough, you can expand that with a microSD card, which is always nice to have. There's a built-in microphone, but no built-in speaker, which is fine for an e-reader. But to be honest, I'd prefer to have it the other way around if I could choose. Of course, there's Wi-Fi included, and via Bluetooth, you can output audio to compensate for that missing speaker. Let's check out the display, because that's actually the most notable upgrade here. The Boox Go 6 uses Carta 1300 technology now, which in terms of responsiveness and contrast levels is the best you can get at the moment. It got the nowadays typical 300 ppi resolution, same as the Carta screen in the Poke 5. But contrast levels are indeed noticeably better. Putting the Boox Go 6 side by side with the predecessor, and I just continue to call the Poke 5 that because, let's be honest, it is, you notice the deeper black levels on the Go 6. The difference is noticeable when the frontlights are off, but more pronounced when dialing up the built-in lights. I wouldn't say it's a night and day difference because the contrast levels on the Poke 5 were already good, but the screen on the Boox Go 6 definitely has more punch to it. It's very similar to the Kobo Clara black and white, but the front light on the Boox Go 6 gets much brighter. The maximum brightness of the cold white LEDs is 210 nits and 155 nits for the warm white LEDs. Both levels are incredibly bright, and truth be told, I doubt many people will need the front light to be that bright. But as I often say, better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. The frontlight quality is good, but not the best I've seen. Towards the top, there's a very slight color shift that you might notice if you're sensitive to something like this. but I doubt it's an issue for most people. When turning down the brightness to more practical levels, it's less noticeable. Besides the better contrast levels, the ink Carta 1300 technology also offers slightly quicker response times compared to the older ink tech. It's not the biggest difference, but it's another small improvement that adds to an overall better experience with the Boox Go 6 in general. Ghosting, on the other hand, is essentially the same as before and depending on the application can be more or less noticeable. The Boox Go 6 doesn't have Boox Super Refresh technology and relies on the usual 4 refresh modes. These allow you to switch to faster but lower quality ink modes to make Android usable on the ink screen. Because Android and most apps aren't meant to run on a display like this. The fastest mode even works for videos, of course with the usual compromises in quality and refresh rate, but it still works surprisingly well. But of course, that's just for showcasing the capabilities, because most people won't watch a video on here. What it does highlight, however, is that even more dynamic Android apps can be used on here. Which brings us to Android 11. Yes, the Boox Go 6 still runs Android 11, which was honestly a surprise because Boox has been launching Android 12 devices these past couple of months, and the Go 6 was actually also announced to run version 12. Why that's not the case, I don't know. I asked Boox about it, but I didn't get a response to that question. Obviously, having a newer Android version would have been better, but Android 11 is still fine when it comes to app compatibility. Yes, it recently reached end of life, but roughly 20% of Android devices still use this version. So I suspect most apps won't drop support for it anytime soon. One very welcome update is the Android security patch to February 2024, which is the last one for Android 11. So Boox is actually listening to feedback because I'm always pointing out the outdated security patches in my reviews. So yes, this is not the latest Android version, but it's at least a big step in the right direction when it comes to the device's security, and hopefully we will see the company continue to commit to regular updates in that regard. In terms of data privacy, it's the same old thing on the other hand. Onyx has a privacy policy in place that can be accessed from within the settings, but the device is still phoning home once in a while, which I tested with Wireshark, and I'd like to see an option to opt out of that. The Boox Go 6 has Google Play Store integration, so you can easily install apps like you would on your phone or tablet. There's also a dedicated Boox App Store on here, but I wouldn't recommend using that one because the disclaimer states that they don't verify the integrity and safety of the provided apps. So that's not really confidence inspiring, which is why I'd rather stick to the Google Play Store. So even though the eReader does run Android, it's not your typical Android experience. The user interface was heavily customized for the ink screen. Same as with other Boox devices, it's generally well done. But compared to e-readers from Amazon, Kobo and Pocketbook, the user interface is still a bit more complicated to use, because there are so many different functions and not all of them are self-explanatory. So the learning curve is a bit steeper than with mainstream devices. But once you get the hang of it, it's not really a problem. The ebook library is well structured, offering a couple of filtering and sorting options. There are also cloud service integrations available, so you can sync your books to Dropbox or Google Drive, for example. Inside a book, you get a lot of different options, so let's start with the text styling options, which were redesigned and look much nicer than they did when the Poke 5 launched. You can adjust text size, font weight, change the font itself, and adapt margins and spacings to create a very personalized experience on here. By long pressing a word, you can use additional features like the dictionary function that's now using an online dictionary by default. For translations, you can swipe to the right side. Those are also done by online services either with Bing, Google or Baidu. You can even translate whole paragraphs like this, which can be really helpful. On-device dictionaries aren't that great, however, because there are only 3 available to download directly, 2 of which are Chinese, and the link to download more just opens the browser for you to search compatible dictionaries yourself. that part is definitely much better with the competition from Kindle, Kobo, or Pocketbook. You can also annotate ebooks and highlight text via the context menu. There's even a pretty nice text-to-speech function available, which is the same one we know from other Boox devices. However, since the Boox Go 6 doesn't have a built-in speaker, you need to use Bluetooth for audio output. But once that's set, you can let the device automatically convert text to speech, which is done via the default Android speech synthesis. You can adapt language, speaker, and dialect. Quality is good, but of course not as good as with a professionally recorded audiobook. But it can work as a nice reading aid nonetheless. So let's listen to it.
Chapter I. IT is a truth universally acknowledged, that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood. This truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of the daughters.
Even though the 6-inch screen is pretty small, the Boox Go 6 is actually a surprisingly good PDF reader as well. The 300 ppi resolution is good enough to read even tiny text, but more importantly, the PDF viewing modes are super helpful for automatically zooming in. It's especially useful with multi-column scientific papers, for example. It's essentially the best PDF viewer you can get in a device like this. Even complex, large format PDFs work well thanks to the fast CPU. The built-in store, on the other hand, isn't really that useful. It offers free public domain books and no contemporary literature. So it's of course nice to have, but if you want to read something more modern, you need to either use another store via the browser or an Android app. You can purchase ebooks on your computer as well, of course, and transfer them via USB. Just make sure to check the DRM status when doing so. Installing the Kindle or Kobo app are probably the easiest ways to buy ebooks on here. You can also install the Libby app to borrow ebooks from your local library. So in short, you get a lot of different options with Android. The only thing you have to keep in mind is that you might need to tinker with the e-ink viewing modes a bit to get optimal results, because after all, most apps aren't meant to run on an e-ink screen and will have animations and poor contrast colors, for example. That can be overcome most of the time with the e-ink settings. At first, it might be a bit complicated to use, but once you get the hang of that as well, it's easy. And last but not least, just a quick word about battery life. In my usual test, where I turn a page every 15 seconds, the Boox Go 6 only drains around 3% of charge per hour without the Frontlight and 4% per hour with the Frontlight at half of the maximum brightness, resulting in a battery life of 25 to 33 hours with a full charge of the 1500 milliamp hours battery. But with using Android apps, different e-ink modes and other Frontlight settings, that runtime can get much lower as well, so keep that in mind. But all in all, battery life is pretty great for the small e-reader. The Boox Go 6 is a pretty straightforward, compact Android e-reader. It got a nice build quality and good specs, with a very nice high-contrast ink Carta 1300 display. And even though the learning curve is a bit steeper than with the competition, after the initial starting phase, it's not too complicated to use. One thing I haven't mentioned yet, but is obviously very important, is the price. With the Poke 5, that was on the higher side, especially when comparing it to the Kindle Paperwhite. The Boox Go 6 not only got lighter, but also cheaper. Instead of $170 or 190 euros of the predecessor, the Boox Go 6 is now $150 or 170 euros, so $20 cheaper. So I'd say that's essentially the most important change here, because with that price point, the Boox Go 6 makes a lot more sense than it was the case with the Poke 5. It still needs to compete with the Kindle Paperwhite, which has a few advantages and is the same price in the US and 20 euros cheaper in the EU. But still, the Boox Go 6's price is more competitive now. The biggest selling point with the Boox Go 6 is the flexibility you get with Android, because as I said, you can simply use different reading apps fairly easily, which can be useful. And the text-to-speech function via Bluetooth and great PDF features are on the plus side as well. Please like and subscribe if you found this review helpful, and to also not miss future ones. Thanks for your time watching, and I'll see you in the next one.